I'd like to tell you about two extraordinary Jewish women, separated by almost 100 years, and how they have influenced the saying of Kaddish, the mourner's prayer, by Orthodox women. In 1916, Henrietta Sold's mother died. Sold was a brilliant scholar and activist. She founded the Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, and she was the force behind the Youth Aliyah movement of the 1930s, which brought young people from Europe to what was then called Palestine. Sold was one of 8 daughters, and when her mother died, a male family friend kindly offered to say Kaddish on behalf of all the girls. In Sold's reply to him, she thanked him but explained that she could not accept his kind offer. And she wrote, "The Kaddish means to me that the survivor publicly manifests his wish and intention to assume the relation to the Jewish community which his parents had, and so that the chain of tradition remains unbroken from generation to generation, each adding his own link. You can do that for the generations of your family, but I must do it for the generations of my family." In 2014, nearly 100 years later, Racheli Frankel stood up to say Kaddish at the very public funeral of her son who was killed by terrorists. No one will forget that heartfelt Kaddish, and no one would question the right for her to say those powerful words. As a respected religious woman who teaches at other women at Orthodox institutions across Israel, Racheli Frankel's Kaddish was more than just an act of her own faith. It was a Kaddish that changed the narrative about women's participation in public mourning. I too have had to say too many Kaddishes in my life, and over the years I've seen many changes relating to the practice of Orthodox women saying Kaddish. 40 years ago, when my mother died, I accepted those laws and customs unquestioningly. Of course, I was at the funeral, but I was young and I didn't expect to say Kaddish, and I didn't really understand why it was so important for me to do so. Secretly, I was relieved that my brother had that responsibility. And then about 10 years later, my father died, but I felt very differently. I was older and I knew more, and I began to appreciate the historical and the social context of Jewish law. I learnt that women can, in fact, say Kaddish, and that a few women in the past have actually said Kaddish, and they've said it with rabbinical support. But over time, social custom and a lack of women's education has meant that women have denied themselves the opportunity to say Kaddish. The issue of a daughter saying Kaddish first appears in the halachic literature of the 17th century in the work of a rabbi named Yair Chaim Bachrach. It was in Amsterdam, and a girl wanted to say Kaddish for her father. He explained several reasons why legally this would be permitted. However, in his final analysis, he concluded that he would not allow the daughter to say Kaddish because it might change the accepted social norm of the city. Clearly, this was a matter of public policy and not halakha. This source, together with many other sources, can be found in the sheets that have been supplied with this talk. In more modern times, rabbinic leaders, including Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and Rabbi Yosef Eliyahu Henkin, have also agreed on the permissibility of a woman saying Kaddish and have accepted that this is socially acceptable. While, of course, there have been others who have continued to say that while it might be legally permissible, it is not acceptable. In 1997, I published a book called Under My Hat. This was part memoir about raising daughters in an Orthodox environment, while at the same time confronting the challenges of feminism, thinking about how to adapt certain rituals. The framework was the Jewish life cycle, how to create meaningful ceremonies to celebrate a baby's birth, baby girl's birth, a bat mitzvah, a wedding. And I also talked about Kaddish and my experiences. And as part of writing my book, I went to speak to a lot of groups, and the one thing they all wanted to talk about was the impact as a woman of not being able to say Kaddish. And men and women have shared very different perspectives. Several women have told me that they left the Orthodox synagogue of their youth because they could not say the Kaddish prayer after the death of a parent. At their moment of grief, their spiritual needs were ignored. Even though they found it difficult to leave the orthodoxy of their youth, they felt so strongly about wanting to say Kaddish that they went to a reform or a conservative shul. And it seemed to me that in those synagogues that they were welcomed into, they not only mourned the loss of their parent, they actually were also mourning the loss of the traditional upbringing, which at a time of their need had let them down. For men, however, they often told me that saying Kaddish was a way of returning to Judaism. It motivated them to rejoin their community. It was common that as young adults they let go of some of their traditions that they had as children. However, sadly, when a parent died, they decided that they really wanted to honour their parents' wishes and they wanted to give support to the remaining parent. Through the process of daily attendance at shul, or coming once in a while, or coming regularly on Shabbat, whatever it was, whenever they would engage with their synagogue community, they felt the comfort and the welcome of another group of people who were able to understand and able to support them during this difficult time. In fact, one person told me that her family kept nothing. We didn't belong to a synagogue. We didn't even fast on Yom Kippur. But after her husband's mother died, he wanted to say Kaddish for her. He started bringing his children to shul on Shabbat mornings. He wanted to have a Seder on Pesach, and he became very particular about fasting on Yom Kippur. Now their whole family are staunch members of their community, each taking an active part in either a religious or a cultural aspect of Judaism. For men, Kaddish has been a way into the community. For women, Kaddish has often been a way out of the community. And what strikes me most is that many Orthodox rabbis don't seem to realize that if they welcome the women to their synagogues to say Kaddish, the women may bring their families along as well. And although a small number of Orthodox rabbis have supported women who want to say Kaddish, many Orthodox communities still perpetuate the view that a woman saying Kaddish is making waves, or even worse, she's a bit of a feminist. The irony is that many women are more religious than their male siblings and are ready and willing to take on the obligation of saying Kaddish more seriously. But it doesn't always happen, and some men worry that saying Kaddish means that a woman would neglect her family responsibilities. Of course, these are responsibilities she shouldn't neglect, but rabbis have to understand that women have all sorts of responsibilities and saying Kaddish will come at different stages of their lives. For example, at the time of my mother and father's death, I was a single woman with no children, so I didn't have those primary family responsibilities to attend to. So how does a rabbi justify that position? Perhaps he, like many other men, were not fully aware of how important it is for women to acknowledge their grief and participate in the rituals of mourning. And until recently, very little public voice was given to that excluded woman's voice of distress, or her cathartic need to recite Kaddish with a minyan. There are several links I've given to you, some beautiful pieces written by women about what it feels like to be excluded, and then how their lives have changed once they've been included, and I can recommend that you read them when you have a moment. My book Under My Hat was actually republished last year, 20 years after the first edition, and I provided an update on what has happened over the last 20 years. I'm delighted to say that the situation in large parts of the Orthodox community has improved tremendously for women. And of course, there are some areas where things have not improved. But we can see that there have been huge changes. Women are studying traditional texts at a very high level. They are more involved in leadership positions, and they are more engaged in ritual life. And we can see that in particular when it comes to saying Kaddish. In the United Kingdom, for example, the chief rabbi came out in support of women saying Kaddish, encouraging every community to welcome and support women. He produced a booklet explaining Kaddish and talking about how women can seek help and support for saying Kaddish and the importance of it. But part of the challenge is that we have to undo women's fear and embarrassment. Many women can't read the words so easily. In my own shul, a group of us are available to help other women learn the Kaddish and be a support on the day, answering Amen to her tefillah, to her prayer. And on the yard site, on that annual anniversary of a person's death, women will come to our shul to say Kaddish. You have to find the right shul, and I understand that's a challenge, particularly in a small place where there may only be one shul. More recently, unfortunately, I've also had to say Kaddish for my brother. I did not hesitate. I knew what I was doing. I was in a supportive environment and I was very welcome to say Kaddish. And that was a tremendous relief for me and a tremendous part of my healing and my process of mourning. I was also very proud that my nieces, my brother's daughters, were able to say Kaddish in their community. Saying Kaddish is part of the grieving process, and I'm sure that is why the birth of a boy is greeted with a lot of relief, assuming in a community where only a boy will say the Kaddish. He's often called the Kaddishal. It's a diminutive term of affection, saying that this is the one who will say the Kaddish for me. The desire for a boy is purely selfish because the son and not the daughter, sister or wife will be the guarantors of the Kaddish. That is changing. And I'm the mother of 3 daughters. All 3 are my Kaddishals. They've seen me say Kaddish. They know my views about this. And my husband and I have never made them feel any less valuable as daughters. We, when time comes, hope that they will take on the responsibility of Kaddish. But of course, they may choose not to. But the real question is whether I can expect the community to have matured. So if my daughters do want to say Kaddish, that wherever they are, in whichever community they find themselves, other people will not intimidate them into thinking it is not their right. For surely it is their place to grieve, and what use is one's religion, history and culture if we cannot draw strength from it in a time when we are most vulnerable and feeling such sadness and loss. Wishing you all a long life until, as we traditionally say, 120 years old.